others. Okay, our scripture reading for today is Luke 11:37 to 54. And if you have your scripture journals, I'll be reading from mine. Okay, Luke 11:34, 37. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and reclined at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." One of the lawyers answered him, "Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also." And he said, "Woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundations of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering." As he went away from there, the scribes and Pharisees began to press him hard and provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him, to catch him in something he might say. Okay, Pastor Wayne will now preach from this very interesting passage.
All right, good morning, everyone. Good to be with you as we continue in the book of Luke. Just a quick reminder of where we have been. And so we've been in Luke for a while. And what we've been saying is that the first 8 chapters of Luke is all about answering this question of who is Jesus. And that's why Luke, the author of this gospel, front loads all of like Jesus's miracles and all of Jesus's like healings and exorcisms, and all of that gets squeezed into the first 8 chapters of Luke. We are going to see a little bit as we go along. But as we go throughout Luke, you're going to start seeing a little bit of a transition where now it becomes, what does it mean for us to live as a Christian? What does it really mean for us to follow Jesus, right? If this is who Jesus is, first 8 chapters, who is this Jesus? If this is who Jesus is, the rest of the book is going to talk about what does it mean to follow him, right? And we're going to start to see a lot more teaching. We're going to see a lot more exhortations that Jesus makes to various people as we try to figure this out. What does it really mean, right, to follow this Jesus? So one of the biggest transitions, I think, is in Luke chapter 9, verse 53, where it says, "But the people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem," right? So chapter 9 becomes this transition point, and Jesus says, the people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. And these are the 2 things we're actually going to see quite a bit as we go forward here, right? You might have caught the end when Barbara was reading in this passage. We start to see the opposition forming against Jesus, right? It says the people did not receive him, right? The scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers, they're going to start building up this hatred towards Jesus that, of course, will culminate with Jesus' death on the cross, right? But you're going to start to see this hate more and more that people did not receive him. But you're also going to see that Jesus knows that he's on this pathway to the cross. He set his face to Jerusalem. He says, that's where I'm going to go because I know that I'm going to die, but that's where I need to go because this is where God has called me. And you're going to see, even in this passage, right, like Jesus is like sometimes unnecessarily harsh, right? It's like he could have just said it a little bit lighter, like how many times you got to call a guy a fool, or stuff like that. It's like you could have calmed down a little bit, but no, he really comes on strong, and a lot of that's because his face is set towards Jerusalem. He knows, right, that he has come to die for his people. He knows that that is where he's going. And so you see a lot of what Jesus does now is all with this mindset that I'm traveling down this road to my death for his people, right? Jesus doesn't avoid it. He doesn't, try to dodge it or escape it, right? All of his actions now have the cross in mind. So these are just two really important points to kind of keep in mind as we continue down through the chapter of Luke. Or through the book of Luke. So in our passage this morning, right, Jesus is not really holding back. He's really going pretty strong on the Pharisees and the lawyers. And just as an outline for today, we're going to look at three different things. So Jesus is going to call them out on three different issues. Right, the first issue that we're going to see is greed. The second issue is going to be that they have neglected justice. And the third issue is going to be that they load people on with burdens. Right? This is the three things. There's really four. There's like a little reputation thing in there. I had to cut that out because I didn't have time. But it's kind of these three main things that Jesus is kind of bring on the Pharisees and the lawyers. Right? These are the issues that we have. As we're going along, we're going to see how Jesus, recommends that as we struggle with these things, perhaps what is the remedy? Right? What are we to do if we are to follow Jesus? Right? As we, might have these three things in our own lives, what does it look like for us to follow Jesus? So with that, let's jump into the first one, right? So the first one is this issue of greed. So read with me, starting again in verse 37, right? It says, while Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked to dine with him, and so he went in and reclined at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, now you, Pharisee, cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. All right, so a couple things to notice here. First, right, the Israelites back then, you've heard me say this before, but they lived in a society that was based on this, governed by this idea of whether you were clean or unclean. And that has really nothing to do with bodily hygiene, or dirt or something, anything like that. It was talking about spiritual, right? They're always thinking, am I clean or am I unclean? And a lot of this is ceremonial cleanliness, or this is, the culture at that time was just based around this idea, right? Am I currently clean? Am I in a state that I am good and holy and good before God? Or am I in a state where I'm defiled and I'm dirty and I need to wash? And so the idea that the Pharisees are talking about here is really not, why didn't Jesus wash his hands, before dinner? But the washing was kind of this idea that you kind of build up spiritual dirt, as you go about your day. Right? Maybe you touch something that's dead. Maybe you kill a fly or a mosquito. I don't know. Or maybe you did something you weren't supposed to do, told a white lie. You kind of build up dirt as you kind of go about your day. And the idea is that in various times throughout the day, you would wash, right? And you wash, and the idea is that it's not only cleanse you physically, but it cleanses you spiritually as well. And so I love that Jesus just doesn't do it, right? It's like the Pharisee asked him to dine with him. It's like he just went in and reclined at a table. Right? We don't think there's anything wrong with that. But for them, they would see that immediately, like, wait, hold on. Right, Jesus, you're not doing the thing that you're supposed to do when you come in and dine. You didn't actually wash. Right? Jesus just walks straight in and sit down. And I think, of course, Jesus does this on purpose. Right? He knew the expectation was for him to wash first. Right? He knew that was the expectation. But he had something to say to the Pharisees, and that's why he purposely just said, I'm just going to go sit down. I know I'm going to get called out on it, and then now I'm going to be able to say this thing that I want to say to the Pharisees. And so, of course, the first thing that he says before them, right, is that they are full of greed and wickedness. Right? That the Pharisees are full of greed and wickedness. Now, this is actually maybe a little bit of a tricky one to apply to our lives, because if I was to ask many of you, if I was to ask you, would you say that you're a greedy person? If you think about it, right, would you say that you're a greedy person? And that's probably if I was to ask you, confess your sins, right? If like, oh, like, come and confess your sins. Like, how many would be like, I confess the sins of greediness. I've been really greedy. Like, probably that's like pretty low on our list of sins that we would confess to, right? That I am greedy. And I think contextually for us, you could probably see this in two different ways, right? Where does greediness show up in our lives? And I think one way that it shows up perhaps is in the sense of the things that we consume, the things that we are looking to buy, the lifestyle that we are looking to live, right? So like our greed maybe isn't like, I just want more money, I just want more money. I mean, maybe a little bit, right? Like, I just want more money. But I think a lot of the greed that it shows up is actually the way in which we spend the money that we do have, right? Thinking that, you just constantly think about, oh, these are the things I want to buy for myself, right? Whether that be clothes, whether that be spending things on entertainment, whether it's spending money on the hobbies that you have, whether it is food, right, eating out a lot, whether it's like vacations, like things that you want to buy for yourself, right? Like maybe we're not continuously greedy when it comes to wanting more money, but we could be greedy in the sense that in the sense of what we want to do with our money. Right, when we think about all these things that we want to spend on, right? And the idea of greed, right, is just this sense of, if I can just get more and more and more of this, then I will be happy, and my life will have purpose, right? If I can just have more, if I just want this, if I can just get more of this, then my life will be even better and happier than where I am now, right? That's kind of like a simple definition of what greed is. And so the first one is like, the things that we consume, right? The things that we want to buy with our money, like we want more. If I could just have a little bit more of that, then my life will be really happy. And the second way I think that this might, greed might subtly come into our lives, in our life, is actually this idea of busyness. And it's kind of interesting. So, I went online and I was like, greed. Do we struggle with greed? I don't know. Do I struggle with greed? As I went online and I looked up and I searched up like modern forms of greed. Like what are modern forms of greed? And it's interesting that multiple authors talked about that actually busyness could be a modern form of greed. And as in the fact that busyness may lead us into greed, or lead us into the subtle form of wanting more out of life. That when we are so busy, right, with so many things that are on our plate, and it's so difficult to, get anything, to meet up together, to do the things that we want to do, it could lead us into this subtle form of, what I have is not enough. Right, because I'm just so busy all the time. I never get time to do the things that I want to do. And in some ways, the busyness of our lives could lead to this, a little subtle desire within us, right, to just want more and more and more, right? And in some ways, like as I'm thinking about this, right, busyness can lead to a lot of self-centered behavior as well. Right, because when you're so busy, you start to think about yourself more, right? You start to think about your calendar more. You start to value your free time and your alone time a lot more, or I think the younger generation calls it me time, right? Just like I need my time to do my thing, right? And there's a sense of it could, this idea of, if I could just get a little bit more time in life, then my life would be a little bit more happy, right? And I think busyness can also sometimes lead to us being super discontent, right? Maybe you've had that feeling, of like, what I am currently doing is not enough. Right? I need more. If my life is really to be meaningful, I need to do even more. I sometimes think like, man, why didn't God like create 30 hours in a day? Like that would be I would be able to do so much more, and life would be better because I'll be able to accomplish more, right? Or sometimes I think this like all the time. I'm like, why did God create us to need sleep like every night? If I could sleep like every other night, like that would be great. Like I have so much time to do stuff, right? Like if I could just have this. And the idea is that it's not that busyness always leads to greed, right? And there's definitely seasons of our life, right, that are just really, really busy. But maybe some of these questions that I was like thinking about, right? Like, for example, do we believe that if I can just have some more time, right, then I can really accomplish so many more things, right, so that my life will have more meaning, right? Or do you think do you think about the fact that if I could just have more time, right, then I can really achieve something really significant with my life? Right, or do we sometimes like daydream about how much more farther along that we would be in life if I just had more time, right, and not have other things hindering my progress? Right, do we maybe sometimes want more in life, right, than what life actually allows us to do? Right, because what is greed, right? Greed is this selfish desire for more and more of something. Right, if I could just have more and more and more of it, right, then my life will have meaning, my life will be more happy. And so, I've been thinking about this in my own life. What does this kind of look like? I think I'm starting to realize that greed doesn't have to be a choice between good and bad. Right? Greed doesn't have to be a choice between, like, I have this good thing that I can do and this bad thing I can do. I'm going to do the good thing. A lot of times, greed actually has to do with there's a lot of good things to do. Right? Like, there's like a lot of good things you can do with your life. And greed, can sometimes make us think, if I could just, I want to do all of it. Right? If I can do all of it, then my life is going to have meaning. And, I've been thinking about this, right? Like, I want to be a good husband, to my wife, right? And a good father to my kids. That takes time, right? I want to be a good pastor. I want to spend, preach good sermons, spend time with you, and do life together, right? That, takes time as well. I want to reach out to the neighborhood that I'm in, right? And I want to be a good neighbor. We went, trick-or-treating on Halloween, and, and I was like, listening to other people's conversation as like we were in our neighborhood, I'm like, why does everyone know each other? Like, I don't even know who these people are. I was like, oh man, am I being a good neighbor, right? Like, am I really investing in the neighborhood that I am living in, right? I also want to invest in Chinatown, right? Like, part of the reason why I'm doing the Suns and other stuff is like, I want to be a good neighbor to the people in Chinatown. I also want to be, involved with, citywide things, right? That's a good thing to do. I also want to spend more time reading, and about various topics that I wish I knew more about. And, every time they come up, I'm like, oh man, I wish I had more time, or better educated, in those things. I also want time to do my hobbies, like building Legos and playing board games and stuff like that. And I just realized I'm like, all these things are good, right? There's nothing that's bad necessarily about any of these things. But I'm starting to realize, I think I'm starting to realize that I can't do all these things at once, right? I can't just have all of these things, right? And then in some ways, maybe I need to choose the most important and prioritize the most important things. And just also realizing, pride kind of creeps into this as well, right? Just realizing that I actually maybe don't have the capacity, right? I just don't have the capacity to do all of these things really, really well. Because the truth is, sometimes busyness, I think, can also be a means of escape. Right? Sometimes busyness can also be a means of not doing the things that we really should be doing. Right? Rather than having that, really important conversation with our spouse or something, we kind of just, oh, I'm just so busy, we don't have time to do that. Or maybe I really should spend more time with my kids. I really should spend more time reaching out to people that God has put in my heart. I should really invite that person out to dinner, and just have them come over our house and spend time together. It's so easy to not do these things, right? Not do the things that, are really important because we're just so, busy all the time. Right, so my point is even though we may not be full of greed, right, in the traditional sense of the word, I do want to, ask each one of us, right, for each one to ask, is that their sense, is there that sense within us, right? If I just had more time, then my life would be so much better, then my life would be so much more meaningful, right? Because the really interesting thing here when it comes to greed, right, is what is Jesus' remedy, right? He calls them full of greed and wickedness. So what is the remedy, right? What are we supposed to do about this? And it's really interesting because what Jesus says is that here's the remedy. Give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. Right, so what Jesus is saying here, right, is that the answer to greed is generosity. Right, the answer to greed is generosity. It's to give away the things that you have. And explicitly, Jesus here is talking about money. Right? I think explicitly, Jesus is here talking about money. But to kind of go back to the ways that we're spending money and the things that our lifestyle and the things that we really want to spend money on, I didn't really spend that much time on that because if I just try to make you guys feel guilty about the things that you're spending money on, right? That actually would be counterintuitive to what Jesus is trying to do. I'll be counterproductive, I should say, of what Jesus is trying to show us here. Right? If I was just sort of trying to make you feel guilty, right? If I just look at your, what you're spending money on, and instead of eating out, how much money did you spend eating out, right? You could have cooked more, right? Or why do you have to drive that car when you could drive a cheaper car? Or why do you have to spend that much money on this instead of that? We could, right? We could go through that exercise and everyone would be like, oh yeah, I should probably, spend less money and be more wise, right? We could do that. Actually, I think that actually, completely misses the point of what Jesus is saying here, because the way that Jesus says the remedy to greed is not to spend less. The remedy to greed is actually to spend more generously. Or the remedy to greed, right, is not to spend less. The remedy to greed is to spend generously. right? To give, to spend generously on people, to see how can I use, all that God has given to me, right? To be generous to other people, right? When Jesus says, as you give alms to those things that are within, right? Just what that means is just meaning you give generously, right? Your money, your time, you make your life about serving others, about loving others. You give to missions, right? You give to those maybe who are especially going to preach Christ with those that have never heard, right? You give to those who need. You become radically generous, right? With the things that you have. And what Jesus says is, guess what will happen, right? What will happen is that everything becomes clean for you. In other words, your life is going to be meaningful and pleasing to God, right? You're no longer going to have a heart that is greedy or wanting more for the things of yourself, right? What happens when you try to be generous is that you begin to have this heart that God has, right? This generous heart to love and to give others. So what's really interesting, right? I think that what Jesus says here, the remedy to greed, right? I think all of us just says, oh, we just have to spend less, right? I'll just have to not be as greedy. But Jesus actually says, no. Right, the remedy to greed is not spend less, but to spend generously, right, on other people. And as we do that, then that love and this desire to build one another up will come out of our lives, right? Everything that we do will start to become clean for us, as Jesus says, or pleasing to God, right? Because we have this heart that is generous. All right, so that's the first thing, right? So, Jesus calls them out for greed. Right? And the remedy is not to spend less, but to spend generously. The second issue with these Pharisees is this idea that they have neglected justice. So let's take a look at this next section. So in verse 42, it says, "But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogue and greetings in the marketplace. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing." All right, so Jesus is kind of bringing the heat a little bit. It's always fun to call people unmarked graves. Before we get to that, let me talk to just real quick about what this meaning woe, right? So when Jesus has said this a couple times, right? He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees," right? And later on, he's going to say, "Woe to you, lawyers." So just real quick about this idea of woe. A lot of times we think that woe means cursed, right? Because a lot of times it happens in these, there's a blessed passage and there's a woe passage, right? So blessed means, you're doing good, and then woe means cursed are you, right? Oftentimes we think woe means cursed. But actually, woe more has a sense of lament and actually has a sense of distress and even empathy, right? So the idea of woe is woe is you means I can't believe you're living your life like this. Don't you see, right? It's a plea of empathy, right? It's not cursed are you, but it's can you see? Can you see that what you're doing is not right, right? Can't you see that you are greedy, right? That you are, you're neglecting justice, right? And so that's the idea of woe, right? Woe isn't saying, I don't want anything to do with these Pharisees, right? Woe is actually Jesus saying, is his way of showing care to, it's like a showing care to the Pharisees. Why are you living your life this way, right? Don't you see that it's not honoring to God, right? Don't you see that you're leading people astray, right? And so the idea of woe isn't just cursed are you, have nothing to do with you. But it really is a plea for them to repent and to see that their ways are not right? And so, that's just real quick on woe. But secondly, he has this part about calling them unmarked graves. So the idea here, right, is that in Jewish culture, the worst thing that you can do is to touch a dead body. So if you touch a corpse, you are ultimately defiled. You're super duper defiled, right? And so you actually have to go through this whole 7-day process of purification, in order for you to be, right and stuff like that. And so basically the idea is you walk through, if you go into a graveyard, and it's that's ultimate defilement. And so what basically Jesus is saying here is that when people interact with you Pharisees, they are becoming ultra defiled, right? It's and they don't even know it. So it's an unmarked grave. You accidentally walk across it and you're defiled. You just don't know it yet. You just don't know it because you didn't realize that was a grave or you just touched a corpse. So basically what Jesus is saying, right, is this, basically interacting with a Pharisee is touching a corpse, right? It's like touching a grave. You don't even, and the worst part is you don't even realize that you are coming in contact with something that will defile you, so much. And so, it's a super cool insult in those days. It doesn't really maybe ring as true for us, but the idea is just it's just you interact with the Pharisee, you become super unclean. And so, so of course this is, it's not surprising why the Pharisees and lawyers get really mad at Jesus. If anyone called us a marked grave, right, we might get a little bit upset. But this is a really brilliant way of Jesus just showing people that, when you interact with the Pharisee, right, you're not actually getting closer to God. Because this is what everyone thought, right? Like you interact with the religious leaders, and they must be really close to God. And what Jesus was saying is that you're not, right? You're actually becoming more and more defiled. And one of the reasons for that is because they have neglected justice, right? And this is the second thing that Jesus calls them out on, that they have neglected justice. And so the idea here, so you have that first line right there, right? You tithe mint and rue and every herb. And so the idea here is like, if you're like a farmer, you would be required to tithe 10% of your crops, right? And so that's kind of how tithing works. Actually, tithing is very generous. Like if you had like a bunch of sheep, like after every 10 sheep, you would tithe the next one, right? So if you had 20 sheep, you would only tithe one. Anyways, so it's generous. It's not like, super harsh. It's not supposed to be like the super, it's just kind of like, I want to give the best to God, right? I want to give the first fruits to God. And so if you're like farming and you have stuff, like you're supposed to tithe 10%. Now, people back then probably didn't tithe herbs, right? Because herbs just like grow everywhere. Like if you, don't grow mint. When I was in seminary, one of my classmates decided to grow mint in a community garden, because he wanted some mojitos. I don't think you're supposed to eat mojitos on campus. But anyways, but he wanted mojitos, and so he grew some mint. That thing just started spreading like everywhere into everyone else's like stuff. I was like, oh, my bad. I probably shouldn't have grown mint. But, so like no one ties like mint and rue and every herb, right? It's just like, oregano, it just grows, right? It's just like, why? And so basically the idea is that these Pharisees are like so nitpicky about every detail, right? They're just like, I'm going to even tithe oregano, right? The amount of oregano I'm going to tithe 10% of that. Right? So basically it's just their way of saying, like, look how holy I am, right? Because look how good I am in doing this. And Jesus' idea is like, you are so detailed about following God's rules and following God's commandments that you've actually missed the weightier issues. You actually missed the bigger issues of showing justice, right, of doing justice and loving God. You look so religious, right, by tithing and being tiny details of your life, or you try to follow God, but you've completely missed the main point, right, of doing justice and loving God, right? And the idea, Jesus actually doesn't say that it's wrong to tithe the mint, right? Jesus doesn't say that it's wrong to be really, very detailed in your desire to obey God in every single detail of your life. Right? Jesus is not saying that that's a wrong thing, right? Because at the end of 42, he says, these you ought to have done without neglecting the others, right? He's not saying you just neglect everything, but he says, but that you've missed the main thing of doing justice. Now, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to do justice? And oftentimes when we think of justice, we just think that, people get what they deserve, right? Or wrongdoers are held accountable, right? Or, victims have their voice heard, right? You just kind of think of these things as what it means to do justice. And that's certainly part of it, but in the Bible, when the word justice actually has a much deeper and broader meaning than that. So Bruce Waltke, he's a really good Old Testament scholar. In one of his books, he kind of like looks at every single passage in Proverbs that talk about what the righteous do and what the wicked does, right? So if you ever read the book of Proverbs, lots and lots of stuff in there. This is what the righteous do. This is what the wicked does. And Bruce Waltke summarizes all of these statements, right? All of these Proverbs with this one thing, right? He says, this is what it means to do justice. This is what it means to be righteous. And he says, to be righteous, the righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. Right? You can also put the righteous, right? So being righteous is not just being a good person, right? But he actually says being righteous is that you're willing to disadvantage yourself so that others can be advantaged. Right, and the wicked, right? It's maybe easier to think about the wicked, right? The wicked are those that are willing to do everything for themselves, and it doesn't matter who else gets hurt. Right? They're willing to disadvantage others in order for them to themselves to gain an advantage. Right? And the interesting thing about being righteous is not just being a good person, right? But it's actually willing to have less, willing to be at a disadvantage so that other people can benefit. Right? And I think each one of us has this responsibility to do justice, right? Not just be a good person, but actually think about what can I sacrifice, right? What can I give up in life so that others can benefit. Are you willing to put yourself in a place of disadvantage so that other people in your lives can benefit, right? And this is the call to worship, right? And this is what God has called every single one of us to do. So Micah 6:6. A really famous passage, right? It says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, right, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Right? All these things are amazing things that people could do for the Lord, but he says, no, he has told you, oh man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Right, what Micah is saying is that what the Lord requires is not all of these offerings, not just focused on the little obediences that we have, even those are important. But it's not just being a good person, but it's using all the power, all the resources, all the money, all the time that God has given to you, right, in order not to benefit yourself, not to think about yourself, right, but to benefit others. And especially if you look through the Old Testament, especially it's the poor and the needy, especially it's those that don't have, the underprivileged, right? Especially focusing on those people to actually love and do good and do justice to them. Now, as I'm thinking about this, and I'm looking around at all of you, I actually think that our congregation really does have the heart to do this. Like, I really think that our congregation actually does have the heart and the desire to do justice, right? I think that I've had conversations with many of you, right? I think there's a desire for us to do this. But in general, I feel like as a church, right, I think that we are in some ways lacking the action. I think we have the desire, but we're lacking the actual execution. We're actually lacking the part where we're, willing to disadvantage ourselves, right, in order to advantage those around us, right, in the neighborhood that we worship in. And, to be honest, this is more of an indictment on me as well, to not, to not be able to, what does it look like for our church to really do this? And this is also not to say that a lot of you guys aren't doing this in your own lives, right? Some of the jobs that you guys have, or, you seek to disadvantage yourself, right, so that others can benefit, right? Or, for example, Joy Fellowship, went out to serve the homeless last week, right, and kind of teaching our kids that as well. But I feel like when it comes to as our church, right, what is our church doing in order to be willing to live this out, right? Really to do justice in the midst of this community. And in many ways, I kind of need your help as well. I need your help in your ideas, right? Of what does it look like for us as a church, right? To be willing to disadvantage ourselves so that others can really benefit. What does it look like to really sacrifice, right, the things that we have in order that others outside our church and our neighborhood can benefit, right? Because as I look at this, and I look at our church, right, I don't want Jesus to say the same thing about our church, right, as he does to these Pharisees, right? And we talk a lot about obedience, right? We talk about a lot on Sunday, right? We talk about what it means to live out the Christian life. Right? We talk a lot about that, and that's good, right? We should talk about those things. But have we missed out on the weightier things, right, of doing justice, of loving God, right? I don't want to just be focused on what it means to live the Christian life, right, without neglecting these main things, right, of doing justice and the love of God. Right, and so in many ways, I think I'm going to need your help, right, to, what does it look like for us, right, as a congregation to really live this out? So, first issue is greed, right? Greed, and the remedy is don't spend less, spend generously. Second issue is neglecting justice with these Pharisees. The remedy is commit to serving the disadvantaged. And then finally, and lastly, the third issue that Jesus had with these Pharisees was loading people with burdens. And of course, the remedy here is the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? Jesus' gospel of grace. And by the way, I love the way that Barbara read the passage, because that's exactly how I read it as well. And so, going on in verse 45, it says, one of the lawyers answered him, "Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also." And he said, "Woe to you, lawyers, also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch these burdens with your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for you killed them, and you build their tombs." So the idea here is that, I love the way Jesus reads it, right? Because the lawyers are probably sitting there, and they're, not super upset with Jesus, like blasting on the Pharisees. Like, yeah, I like this Jesus, right? Like, he's like really calling out the Pharisees. And then he's like, wait, hold on. Like, Jesus, these things affect us too. And Jesus, instead of being like, oh, my bad, like, sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, he just goes all in. He says, woe to you, lawyers also, right? And the lawyers now are being put on notice. And the real issue with the lawyers, right, is that they load people with burdens, right? They're constantly loading people with burdens, right? And so at the end of this passage, right, in verse 42, it says, woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who are entering, right? And so what's going on here is that people are coming to these lawyers, and the lawyers are basically experts of the law, right? They're experts in the Bible, and they may, you may go to lawyers and you say, hey, how do you answer this question? Or how do you, I have a question about the Bible, what should I do about it? And basically what Jesus is saying is these lawyers, like they're supposed to be experts in the Bible, right? But not only do they not know God, but they actually are preventing others from knowing God as well. And this is a really serious issue, right? Because there's that line there that talks about from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, and the idea here is that Abel was the first righteous person put to death in the Bible, right? So Abel, back in Genesis, was put to death, was killed by his brother Cain, right? One of the first righteous people that was put to death. And in the Jewish Old Testament, they actually organized the Old Testament books differently than we do. And so in the Jewish Old Testament, Second Chronicles is actually the very last book of their scriptures. And in Second Chronicles, at the very end of Second Chronicles, there's Zechariah, the priest. And basically what Zechariah did is he told the people that they had forsaken God, and therefore God will forsake you. And King Joash at the time didn't like that, and so he had Zechariah killed in the temple. And so basically what Jesus is saying is that from Abel to Zechariah, basically from the first righteous person in your scriptures to the last righteous person in the scriptures, and actually works really well in English, right? From A to Z, from Abel to Zechariah, your teaching, the lawyers, your teaching has prevented people from knowing God. Right? And what was their teaching? Right? What was the teaching of the lawyers? And it's actually really simple. Right? Their teaching is that the only way for God to be pleased with you is if you obey. Right? That was their teaching. Right? Their teaching is, the lawyers were doing something like not too different than what we're doing now, right? We're opening up the scriptures, right? We're opening up the scriptures on Sunday morning, and I am interpreting them and applying them to our lives. And so the people will go up to the lawyers and be like, hey, what does this passage mean, right? Or what am I supposed to do with this passage? And the lawyers will basically answer, right? Do this, right? Or live this way, or fix your life, or do better, right? Every time that people will come up to the lawyers with a question about the Bible, they will leave with more burdens. They'll leave with, these are the more things that you need to do, right? And when we open up the scriptures every Sunday morning, right, it really should breathe life into our lives. But instead, these lawyers, when they open up the scriptures, right, just constantly breathe condemnation into the lives of people. And as a result, the people never actually drew close to God based on their teachings. Right, and so here comes Jesus, and Jesus challenges everything that they built their religious life around. Right, these Pharisees, and lawyers, they thought that they were blessed because they really looked good on the outside. Right, they thought they were blessed because they looked really good at church. They had a really good reputation. Right, they were seen as very religious. And Jesus just looks through all of that. Right, he sees that actually their hearts are wicked, greedy, selfish, and prideful. And what I want to end with today is that what happens when Jesus looks into our lives, right? Outside, inside the veneer that we kind of put up when people are around, right? Jesus also looks into our lives, right? He also sees, right, the greedy, the wicked, the selfish, the pridefulness that is in our hearts, right? And we can't fool God by saying, oh, I'm going to go to church or I'm going to pray a little bit, to cover up my sins, right? But the gospel is that Jesus sees all of it, right? He sees our heart as it is, right? He sees the depths of our sin, and yet he continues to love us. And yet he continues to show us grace. We are worthy to approach God, right? Not because of our human obedience, right? But because of God's grace. And so as we come before the Lord's table, right, this, first Sundays, we celebrate communion together. And as we come to the Lord's table, right, this ceremony that we do every month, right, is meant to remind us of God's grace. And actually, if we look at, if you look at the 3 points, if you look at these 3 things, right, that we see that actually Jesus does all these 3 things for us. Right? When we come to the Lord's table, it reminds us that God has been so generous to us. Right? So how then can we not be generous to others? When we come before the Lord's table, it also reminds us that God does not neglect justice. Right? Jesus himself disadvantaged himself, right? Even to the point of dying on the cross. Right? So we can be righteous in his sight. Right? So how then can we not love those around us with the same sacrificial love? Right? And finally, the bread and the cup, right? It reminds us, and Jesus shows us with the bread, with the cross, that he doesn't load us with more burdens. Right? But rather, Jesus takes those burdens upon himself on the cross. Right? So that he can say, right, come all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Right? So if we look at these 3 things, right, that Jesus was kind of like, talking to the Pharisees about, critiquing the Pharisees about, we actually see Jesus doing the very opposite. He was generous with us. He disadvantaged himself for us, right? And it reminds us that when we come to Jesus, right, that he doesn't load us on with more burdens, but he shows us grace. And so I'm going to, give you a little bit of time to come before the Lord. And as you meditate and pray on these 3 things, I do pray that God would use this time to remind you, right, of the generousness of God, right, and the love of God, and also the peace that comes from our relationship with the Lord. If you are a baptized believer, me and Calvin will be standing up here. I'm going to invite you to come up and receive the elements, go back to your seats, and then we'll partake together. But let's spend some time together before the Lord.